Hey guys, tonight we're stepping back in time, slipping into the opulent, yet surprisingly unappetizing, dining rooms of European royalty. Imagine, if you will, the flickering candlelight casting long shadows across vast tables groaning under the weight of, well, largely unseasoned boiled meats and bland pottages. You're seated beside a monarch, perhaps Louis XIV himself, and you're handed a trencherman's portion of something that vaguely resembles a chicken, but without a hint of salt or pepper, let alone any exotic spices. You might find yourself missing your humble microwave dinner, and you definitely wouldn't survive a single royal banquet without discreetly pushing food around your plate to appear polite. It was a world where presentation trumped pleasure, and quantity often overshadowed quality. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. Tell me, where are you listening from tonight, and what time is it for you? Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You find yourself transported not to a glorious feast, but to a rather mundane midday meal in a sprawling, chilly castle. The air hangs heavy with the scent of roasted meat, yes, but also of damp stone and a faint, lingering aroma of something vaguely medicinal. Forget the vibrant, aromatic dishes you might associate with fine dining today. For much of European history, especially in the early medieval period, the royal table was a place of sustenance, not culinary adventure. You see, the primary concern was calorie intake, pure and simple. Royalty, despite their lofty status, still lived in a world where food preservation was rudimentary at best, and fresh ingredients were often a seasonal luxury. So, you're looking at a plate piled high with boiled beef or mutton, perhaps a thick, grainy bread, and a watery pottage made for whatever root vegetables were available. No zesty marinades, no intricate sauces, just substance. One mainstream historical fact that often surprises people is just how monotonous the royal diet could be. While peasants might have had less variety in terms of ingredient types, royalty often had less variety in preparation. Think about it. If you're a king, you don't need to worry about scarcity in the same way your subjects do. You can afford large quantities of meat. The problem isn't getting the meat. It's making it interesting, especially when culinary traditions were still developing. You might notice a servant meticulously carving a joint of meat with a rather dull knife, presenting slices on a thick slice of stale bread that acts as a plate, a trencher. After the meal, these trenchers, soaked in gravy and juices, were often given to the poor or to the dogs, a sort of medieval recycling program. You probably wouldn't be tempted to snack on yours, though. Now, for a quirky tidbit. Did you know that in some early medieval courts, it was common for royalty to eat with their fingers, even for supposedly elaborate meals? Forks were a very late and initially controversial arrival to the European dining scene. Imagine trying to eat that boiled meat and pottage with your bare hands, try to maintain some semblance of decorum while your fingers got slick with grease. It sounds messy, right? And historians still argue whether the lack of personal hygiene during these meals contributed more to boredom or indigestion. Perhaps a bit of both, if you ask me. The sheer practicality of the situation often overshadowed any desire for refined dining. After all, a fork was seen by many as an effeminate, even suspicious, affectation when it first appeared, particularly in Italy. You're simply expected to grab, tear, and chew. No fuss, no muss, just food. And probably a lot of wiping your hands on the nearest available cloth, or perhaps even your clothes, if you were feeling particularly informal. As you continue your imaginary journey through the royal kitchens of early medieval Europe, you begin to grasp the sheer logistical challenge of feeding a court. It wasn't just about the king and queen, it was about hundreds, sometimes thousands, of retainers, guards, clergy, and servants. Imagine preparing meals for a small town every single day with no refrigeration, no modern sanitation, and very limited means of transportation for fresh goods. This wasn't about culinary artistry. It was about provisioning. You're observing scurrying cooks in a smoky, bustling kitchen, surrounded by rough-hewn tables, open fires, and enormous cauldrons. The air is thick with the smell of wood smoke and simmering stews. One mainstream historical fact to consider is that meat, particularly roasted or boiled, formed the absolute cornerstone of the royal diet. Why? Because it was a visible symbol of wealth and power. If you could afford to consume large quantities of animal protein, it meant you had access to vast lands for hunting or raising livestock. So, while you might find the endless procession of boiled beef or mutton a bit dull, for the monarch, it was a daily declaration of their dominion. Think of it as the medieval equivalent of pulling up in a super luxury car, a very large, very well-fed super luxury car. You might see entire carcasses being hauled in, butchered on site, and then simply roasted over an open fire or boiled for hours to tenderize the tough cuts. Vegetables, if present at all, were usually hardy root crops like parsnips, turnips, or cabbages, often thrown into the same pot as the meat, absorbing its flavor or lack thereof. Now for a quirky detail that might make you wrinkle your nose. In some courts, it was not uncommon to eat stale bread that had been used as a plate. As we touched on earlier, the trencher was a thick slice of coarse bread. Imagine it. You've been eating your fatty, unseasoned meat off this bread, and it's soaked up all the juices and grease. Instead of being discarded immediately, these saturated trenchers might be given to the poor or even, occasionally, consumed by the less particular members of the household. It makes you appreciate your washable plates, doesn't it? The sheer lack of cutlery meant that everything was designed for direct handling, which favored robust, easy-to-manage food items. And here's where historians still argue whether the prevalence of thick, starchy foods and a lack of fresh produce contributed to widespread nutritional deficiencies among the elite, despite their abundance of meat. While they certainly didn't face starvation, conditions like gout, caused by excessive consumption of rich foods, were common. But so too were other, less obvious ailments that might have stemmed from a surprising lack of vitamins. You're watching as a royal physician, a learned but perhaps not entirely effective figure, consults with the king, prescribing various concoctions and herbal remedies, completely oblivious to the simple dietary changes that might actually alleviate many of his ailments. It's a strange paradox: immense wealth, yet remarkably rudimentary nutrition by modern standards. You're still hovering in that medieval royal kitchen, the flickering firelight casting long, dancing shadows. The air is thick with the aroma of roasting meat and simmering grains, a scent that speaks less of gourmet delight and more of sheer survival. This era, stretching from the fall of Rome through much of the High Middle Ages, was defined by a constant, underlying tension, the ever-present threat of famine. Even for royalty, abundance was often precarious, and the memory of lean times shaped their eating habits profoundly. When food was available, you ate it, and you ate a lot of it because you never knew when the next shortage might hit. One mainstream historical fact that highlights this reality is the concept of feast days versus fast days. The Christian calendar dictated a significant number of fast days, sometimes up to half the year, when meat was forbidden. On these days, even royalty consumed fish, if available, eggs, cheese, and vegetables. However, fasting rarely meant eating less. It simply meant abstaining from meat. So, on a fast day, you might be served an enormous pike, boiled and then perhaps smothered in a thick, bland sauce, alongside vast quantities of bread and pottage. The sheer volume was meant to compensate for the lack of variety, a sort of medieval overcompensation. It wasn't about weight loss. It was about spiritual observance and maintaining social status through conspicuous consumption, even of non-meat items. Now for a quirky tidbit about royal dining during these periods. Table manners were evolving, to say the least. While you might imagine refined etiquette, the reality was often far more robust. You'd see nobles sharing trenchers, dipping their hands into communal bowls, and even, on occasion, gnawing directly on bones before tossing them to the dogs beneath the table. Forks, as we mentioned, were still centuries away from widespread adoption, and even knives were primarily for cutting, not for conveying food to the mouth. So, you're watching a king tear off a piece of bread with his bare hands, use it to scoop up some stew, and then wipe his greasy fingers on a piece of cloth, or if no cloth was immediately available, on the nearest available piece of clothing. It sounds barbaric to our modern sensibilities, doesn't it? But for them, it was simply how things were done. Historians still argue whether the perceived blandness of these diets was a matter of taste or necessity. Was it that they genuinely preferred unseasoned food? Or was it simply that the infrastructure for sourcing and preparing complex, highly seasoned dishes didn't yet exist consistently? Perhaps it was a bit of both. You can imagine a royal chef, skilled in roasting an entire boar, but utterly stumped by the idea of a delicate herb sauce. Not because he lacked the skill, but because the herbs simply weren't available fresh, or the demand for such novelty wasn't there. The emphasis was on quantity and caloric density, ensuring the powerful elite remained well-fed and capable of governing, rather than on tantalizing the palate with complex flavors. It's a pragmatic approach to dining, born from a world where scarcity was a much more tangible threat than culinary boredom. You're still within the echoing stone walls of a medieval castle, but now, a new whisper drifts through the air, carried on the occasional breath of a traveling merchant. This whisper speaks of distant lands, of exotic aromas, and of flavors that could transform even the blandest of royal stews: spices. For centuries, European palates have been largely confined to local herbs and a few basic seasonings. But as trade routes slowly, painstakingly began to open, the tantalizing prospect of pepper, cinnamon, cloves, and nutmeg started to trickle into the royal imagination. One mainstream historical fact is that the spice trade was a monumental undertaking, fraught with danger and expense. Spices were not merely flavorings. They were incredible luxuries, status symbols of the highest order. Imagine, if you will, the king's reaction to the arrival of a small pouch of black pepper, fresh from India, having traveled thousands of miles across deserts and seas. It was more valuable than gold, gram for gram. So, while these spices did eventually make their way to royal tables, they were used sparingly, often as a display of immense wealth rather than a true culinary enhancement. You wouldn't find a liberal dash of cinnamon on everything. Instead, it might be dusted delicately over a single, precious dish for a visiting dignitary. Now for a quirky tidbit. Some historians believe that spices were initially valued not just for their flavor, but for their perceived medicinal properties and their ability to mask the taste of food that was, shall we say, less than fresh. Without refrigeration, meat and other perishables spoiled quickly. While spices certainly couldn't make truly rotten food safe, a generous dusting of cloves or nutmeg might make a slightly off-meat dish more palatable. Imagine the sigh of relief from a medieval diner when a dish, perhaps on the edge of turning, arrived heavily spiced, masking any telltale signs of its journey. You might even catch a royal cook in a moment of quiet desperation, reaching for the ginger to save a batch of questionable poultry. And this leads to a debate that historians still argue. Were spices truly used to improve taste, or were they primarily a display of wealth and a practical solution to food spoilage? While modern chefs celebrate the complex flavor profiles spices can add, their medieval counterparts might have viewed them through a very different lens. You're watching a royal chef meticulously counting out precious peppercorns, not because he's aiming for a perfectly balanced flavor, but because each grain represents a fortune, and its presence on the plate screams of his master's power and reach. The idea of a subtle culinary balance was often secondary to the sheer statement of owning and consuming such rare commodities. So, while the spice trade slowly began to chip away at the blandness, it was a very, very slow process, punctuated by exorbitant costs and practical limitations. The tantalizing whisper of spices might have reached the royal ear, but the day-to-day reality of feeding a European court remained an immense, grinding logistical operation. You are now standing, perhaps a little too close for comfort, amidst the organized chaos of a royal kitchen in a grand castle of the High Middle Ages. This isn't just a place for cooking. It's a small factory a bustling ecosystem of cooks, scullions, carvers, bakers, and countless other specialized roles, all working to a relentless schedule. The sheer scale is staggering. One mainstream historical fact to absorb here is that royal households were essentially self-sufficient communities. They often traveled with a monarch, moving from one castle to another, consuming local resources as they went. Imagine the provisioning challenge. Not just acquiring food, but transporting it, storing it without spoilage, and preparing it for hundreds, if not thousands, of people. You see enormous pantries, often cold and dark, filled with barrels of salted meat, sacks of grain, and huge rounds of cheese. The concept of farm to table was less a trendy philosophy and more the only way things could be done. Animals would be slaughtered on site, bread baked daily in vast ovens, and vegetables, if in season, picked from nearby gardens. The kitchen itself is a cacophony of sounds. The rhythmic thud of choppers, the sizzle of fat, the clatter of earthenware, and the constant murmur of commands. Now for a quirky detail that might make you grateful for modern conveniences: the lack of proper ventilation in these kitchens. Imagine the smoke, the heat, the constant smell of cooking, all trapped within stone walls. You'd emerge from this environment smelling like a barbecue that had gone terribly, wonderfully wrong. Royal cooks often suffered from respiratory ailments, and the constant exposure to open flames and smoke would have made their lives incredibly arduous. You might observe a particularly grimy cook, his face streaked with soot, wiping sweat from his brow as he shovels more wood into a roaring fire, his eyes red from the smoke. It wasn't a glamorous job, despite the grandness of the meals they produced. Historians still argue whether the perceived uniformity of royal diets was due to a lack of culinary imagination or simply the immense practical constraints of the time. Was it truly a preference for bland, simple dishes, or was it the overwhelming difficulty of consistently producing varied, flavorful meals on such a scale, with such limited resources? You're watching a head cook, known as the master of the kitchen, poring over ledgers, meticulously accounting for every pound of flour and every fowl. His primary concern isn't surprising the king with a new flavor combination. It's ensuring that everyone, from the lowest stable boy to the highest noble, receives their allocated sustenance for the day. Innovation, in this context, was a distant second to efficiency and basic survival. The grandness of the castle, paradoxically, often housed a kitchen that operated on surprisingly utilitarian principles. The medieval kitchens, with their emphasis on quantity and basic sustenance, slowly began to give way to a new era, one where artistic expression and intellectual curiosity began to permeate all aspects of life, including the dining table. You're now transitioning into the Renaissance, a period of blossoming culture across Europe, where the pursuit of beauty and knowledge wasn't confined to art and philosophy, but extended, surprisingly, to food. However, this didn't necessarily translate into more tasty food for royalty, but rather more visually impressive food. One mainstream historical fact from this period is the rise of banqueting as a theatrical spectacle. No longer was a royal meal just about eating. It was a carefully choreographed performance designed to impress, intimidate, and entertain. Imagine walking into a Renaissance banquet hall. You wouldn't immediately notice the food's flavor, but its sheer artistic presentation would capture your attention. There might be elaborate sugar sculptures, known as subtleties, depicting mythical creatures or famous battles. Peacocks, once roasted, might be redressed in their own feathers for a dazzling display, or swans presented with gilded beaks. The goal wasn't a delicious meal, but a feast for the eyes, a demonstration of the host's wealth, sophistication, and access to skilled artisans. You'd be more likely to gasp at the spectacle than salivate over the dishes. Now, for a quirky tidbit, the use of gold leaf on food. Yes, literally gold. While entirely flavorless and offering no nutritional benefit, edible gold leaf was liberally applied to dishes to emphasize their preciousness and the host's immense wealth. Imagine a perfectly roasted boar, perhaps still with its head, meticulously covered in shimmering gold leaf. It sounds outlandish, right? It was purely for show, an edible flex. You might even see fruits and desserts dusted with powdered gold, sparkling under the candlelight. It's a reminder that aesthetics often took precedence over taste or even common sense. Historians still argue whether the elaborate displays of the Renaissance were a genuine attempt at culinary artistry or simply another form of conspicuous consumption designed to reinforce social hierarchy. Was the lack of truly innovative flavor profiles due to a cultural preference for grand visuals, or were chefs simply limited by the ingredients and techniques of the time? You're watching a nervous chef overseeing the final touches on a dish, meticulously arranging gilded apples, not because he's perfecting a flavor combination, but because he knows the king's eye, not his palate, is the ultimate judge. The emphasis was on spectacle, on creating an experience that left guests awestruck, even if the actual eating of the food was still a rather bland affair. It was about seeing and being seen, far more than about truly savoring each bite. As the Renaissance flourished, bringing with it an appreciation for exploration and discovery, Europe's horizons quite literally expanded. And with those expanded horizons came entirely new foodstuffs from lands previously unknown. You are now witnessing the very earliest trickle of New World ingredients making their way to European royal tables. But be warned, the adoption of these revolutionary foods was anything but immediate or enthusiastic. One mainstream historical fact from this era is the introduction of the potato and the tomato to Europe. Imagine, for centuries, the European diet was largely based on grains, root vegetables like turnips and parsnips, and protein. Then, suddenly, explorers returned with these peculiar new plants from the Americas. The potato, initially, was viewed with deep suspicion. It grew underground, which made some people wary, associating it with witches and devils. Furthermore, early varieties could be quite bitter, and it took generations of cultivation to develop the palatable spuds we know today. You're watching a royal gardener gingerly handling a strange, lumpy tuber, unsure whether to plant it for food or simply as an ornamental curiosity. It's hard to fathom now, but this humble vegetable, which would later become a dietary staple across the continent, was initially treated with extreme caution, sometimes even outright fear, by the very people who could afford to experiment with it. Now for a quirky tidbit. The tomato, even more so than the potato, was often regarded with intense suspicion, sometimes even being called the poison apple. Why? Because it's a member of the nightshade family, some of which are indeed poisonous. While the fruit itself was safe, the leaves and stems are toxic. Perhaps more importantly, early European aristocrats often ate off pewter plates, which contained lead. The acidity of the tomatoes would leach lead from the plates, causing lead poisoning, leading people to wrongly conclude that the tomatoes themselves were deadly. Imagine a royal chef, curious but cautious, trying to introduce this vibrant red fruit, only for the monarch to fall ill from the plate, not the produce. You can almost hear the murmurs of, "I told you so," echoing through the royal kitchens. Historians still argue whether the slow adoption of these revolutionary crops was primarily due to cultural conservatism, agricultural challenges, or genuine health concerns stemming from misunderstandings. Was it simply that people preferred the familiar, or were there legitimate reasons, however misguided, for their hesitation? You're observing a royal physician advising the queen to avoid the new American fruits, citing vague concerns about humors and bodily imbalances. The idea that something so alien could be safely incorporated into the noble diet was a slow and painstaking acceptance. So, while these now ubiquitous ingredients eventually transformed European cuisine, for centuries they remained curiosities, grown in botanical gardens rather than consumed at royal banquets, contributing little to alleviate the prevailing blandness of the royal table. As we move through the centuries, you're observing a fascinating paradox: immense wealth and access to resources, yet a pervasive anxiety about health, particularly when it came to food. For European royalty, dining wasn't just about sustenance or spectacle. It was deeply intertwined with theories of medicine, humors, and the ever-present fear of illness. leading to some truly peculiar dietary choices. One mainstream historical fact is the profound influence of Galenic medicine on royal diets for centuries. This ancient Greek system, which dominated medical thought until well into the early modern period, believed the body was composed of four humors: blood, yellow bile, black bile, and phlegm, that illness resulted from an imbalance of these. Foods were classified as hot, cold, wet, or dry, and royal physicians meticulously prescribed diets to maintain or restore balance. You're witnessing a physician earnestly advising a queen that she must consume more moist foods like boiled chicken to counteract her dry disposition, even if what she truly craves is a crisp, roasted duck. The emphasis was not on taste or pleasure, but on perceived therapeutic properties, often leading to incredibly bland and repetitive meals for health's sake. Now for a quirky tidbit: the belief that certain strong-smelling foods could ward off disease, even if they tasted terrible. Garlic, for instance, was often consumed not for its flavor, but for its supposed protective qualities against plagues and other ailments. Imagine a royal court where everyone is subtly, or not so subtly, reeking of garlic, all in the name of preventative medicine. You might even spot a prince reluctantly nibbling on a raw onion, convinced it will keep him healthy. This obsession with health, however misguided by modern standards, led to dietary choices that prioritize perceived medicinal benefits over culinary enjoyment, often compounding the inherent blandness of the food. Historians still argue whether the extreme conservatism in royal diets, particularly regarding new ingredients or unconventional preparations, was a result of genuine medical concerns or simply a convenient justification for maintaining established traditions and avoiding perceived risks. Was it truly about health, or was it about a deep-seated fear of anything that might upset the delicate balance of a monarch's powerful, yet fragile body? You're observing a royal chef, eager to experiment with a new technique, being overruled by a stern-faced physician who insists on a traditional, boiled preparation because it is deemed safer for the king's constitution. This rigid adherence to ancient medical theories often stifled culinary innovation at the highest levels, ensuring that even as the world changed, the royal plate remained stubbornly, predictably bland. As European royalty grappled with new foods and ancient medical theories, another powerful force shaped their dining habits: the rigid social hierarchy of the age. You're now witnessing a banquet where every dish, every serving, and even the very act of eating is a deliberate performance, a declaration of status and power. Food wasn't just sustenance. It was a carefully controlled medium for displaying wealth, influence, and your precise position within the complex social ladder. One mainstream historical fact that perfectly illustrates this is the implementation of sumptuary laws. These were laws enacted across Europe for centuries, specifically designed to regulate consumption based on social class. While they often focused on clothing and textiles, they sometimes extended to food. For example, certain expensive spices, rare meats, or particular types of wine might be legally restricted to only the nobility or even just royalty. Imagine trying to host a feast as a wealthy merchant, eager to show off your success, only to be legally forbidden from serving a dish of swan or venison because you weren't of noble birth. These laws weren't about economics. They were about maintaining a visible distinction between the elite and everyone else. You'd see a king being served a platter of intricate game pies, while a lesser noble at the same table might receive only simpler, less prestigious cuts, a silent but clear reminder of their respective ranks. Now for a quirky tidbit that underscores this social stratification: the concept of eating above the salt. In grand medieval and early modern dining halls, a large salt cellar often sat in the middle of the main table. Those of higher rank sat above the salt, closer to the head of the table and the host, receiving the finest cuts and perhaps the rare spiced dishes. Those of lesser status sat below the salt, further down the table, often receiving plainer fare and less attentive service. It was a subtle but profoundly clear visual cue of one social standing. You might observe a minor baron trying to stretch his neck to catch a glimpse of the king's gilded pheasant, while resignedly chewing on his more humble portion of boiled mutton, knowing his place was firmly below the salt. Historians still argue whether the blandness often associated with royal diets, despite the potential for lavish display, was a direct consequence of this obsession with status and control. Was the focus so entirely on the display of wealth and power that the actual taste of the food became secondary? Or was it simply that the very concept of haute cuisine, as we know it today, hadn't fully developed beyond the spectacular? You're watching a master carver present a massive joint of beef to the king with an elaborate flourish, knowing that the king's attention is primarily on the ceremony, not necessarily on the flavor of the meat itself. The food was a prop in a grand, daily drama of power, and its culinary quality often played a surprisingly minor role. The grandeur of the Renaissance was amplified to an almost absurd degree in the court of Louis XIV of France, the Sun King, particularly at his magnificent palace of Versailles. You are now stepping into this world of unparalleled opulence, where the royal table wasn't just a place to eat, but the very epicenter of political power and social control. The food, though still often bland by modern standards, became an integral part of this meticulously orchestrated spectacle. One mainstream historical fact about Louis XIV court is his absolute obsession with etiquette and ceremony. Every aspect of his life, from waking up to going to bed, was a public performance, and dining was no exception. Imagine being a guest at Versailles during a grand couvert, where Louis XIV would dine publicly, surrounded by courtiers who watched his every move. The sheer volume of food presented was staggering, dozens of dishes, often repeated, designed to impress with sheer quantity rather than culinary finesse. You'd see enormous platters of roasted meats, jellied concoctions, and endless pastries, all meticulously arranged. The goal wasn't for the king to eat all of it, but for him to display his boundless wealth and the abundance of his kingdom. It was less a meal and more a choreographed ballet of consumption. Now for a quirky tidbit that highlights the strangeness of Versailles dining. The king often ate alone or with a very select few, while hundreds of nobles stood watching, often for hours. They weren't there to eat. They were there to witness the king's sacred act of dining, a privilege in itself. Imagine standing for 2 hours, watching someone else eat a seemingly endless procession of unseasoned boiled fowl and pastries, while you yourself might be starving. You can almost feel the collective pang of hunger mixed with awe from the assembled courtiers. This peculiar custom underscores how far removed royal dining was from simple sustenance. It was a projection of divine right and absolute power, served up with a side of blandness. Historians still argue whether the culinary stagnation at Versailles was a result of the sheer scale of the operation, where efficiency and presentation trumped flavor, or if it reflected a genuine preference for less complex, more pure tastes among the French aristocracy of the time. Was it a triumph of logistics over gastronomy, or a deliberate choice? You're observing a chef, renowned for his ability to manage a vast kitchen, meticulously overseeing the placement of each dish, ensuring symmetry and visual impact, while perhaps secretly wishing he could add a little more zing to the rather uninspired sauces. The focus was on the external display, the magnificent show, and the quiet internal blandness was simply part of the package. Leaving behind the theatrical grandeur of Versailles, we now glide into the Georgian era in Great Britain, a period roughly spanning the 18th and early 19th centuries. Here, the royal table, while still a display of wealth, often leaned into an era of almost comical excess in terms of quantity, combined with a persistent, almost stubborn blandness of flavor. You're entering a dining room where sheer volume is king, and subtlety has been politely, yet firmly, shown the door. One mainstream historical fact of this period is the sheer quantity of food presented at a single meal, even if much of it went uneaten. Imagine a royal breakfast that consisted not of a simple pastry and coffee, but of cold meats, various breads, sometimes even beer, alongside a bewildering array of sweet and savory dishes. Dinners were even more extravagant. You might see a table groaning under dozens of different dishes, roasts, stews, jellies, tarts, all served simultaneously in what was known as service à la française. The idea was to overwhelm the senses with abundance, a visual testament to the monarch's prosperity. You'd find yourself gazing at mountains of food, perhaps feeling a little overwhelmed by the sheer scale, but probably not by any exciting aromas. Now for a quirky tidbit that adds to the bizarre charm of Georgian dining: the occasional inclusion of what we might call novelty dishes, which were more about spectacle than sustenance. One example is the famed roast swan, sometimes even presented redressed in its feathers. While certainly eye-catching, swan meat is notoriously tough and gamey. Or imagine an entire roasted boar's head, complete with an apple in its mouth again, visually impressive, but perhaps not the most appetizing. You might even see peculiar gelatin molds or sugared subtleties that were more architectural than edible. It all speaks to a culinary philosophy where the visual impact often superseded the actual deliciousness of the food. It was all about creating a talking point, not a craving. Historians still argue whether this era's continued blandness was due to a lack of sophisticated cooking techniques, a preference for natural, unadulterated flavors, unlikely given the occasional oddities, or simply a continuation of the tradition of volume over refinement. Was the sheer effort of producing so much food enough to exhaust any desire for complex flavoring? You're observing a cook, perhaps slightly jaded, presenting a newly roasted joint of beef, knowing it will be admired for its size, but not necessarily for its subtle seasoning. The Georgian royal table was an exercise in abundance, often at the expense of genuine culinary pleasure, providing much visual feast but little for the discerning palate. As the 19th century dawned, bringing with it the transformative power of the Industrial Revolution, the royal dining table in Europe, particularly in Victorian Britain, underwent another subtle shift. While still grand, the emphasis moved from sheer, overflowing quantity to a rigid adherence to etiquette and formality. You're now in a Victorian royal dining room, where every fork, every glass, and every utterance is governed by an unspoken, yet ironclad, set of rules. The food, however, often remains surprisingly unremarkable in flavor. One mainstream historical fact that defines this era is the rise of service à la Russe, which gradually replaced the older service à la Française. Instead of all dishes being laid out on the table at once, food was now brought to the table course by course, carved and served by liveried footmen. This created a more elegant, controlled dining experience, allowing for more intricate plating, though still relatively simple by today's standards. Imagine a succession of dishes, each presented individually, perhaps a clear soup, followed by a fish course, then a roast, then a game dish, and so on, often totaling many courses. You'd be presented with each dish, and a servant would offer a portion, allowing you to select what you wished. This might sound more refined, but it also meant a longer, more drawn-out meal with less opportunity for individual choice. Now for a quirky tidbit that speaks to the rigid formality, the sheer number of specialized utensils at a Victorian table. Forks of different... Imagine trying to navigate this array of gleaming silver, constantly aware of which implement was appropriate for which food item. It wasn't about savoring the meal, it was about performing the correct social rituals. You might even see a minor dignitary subtly mimicking the queen's use of a specific fork, anxious not to commit a social faux pas. This excessive emphasis on table manners often overshadowed any real enjoyment of the food itself, turning dining into a test of social prowess rather than a pleasant culinary experience. Historians still argue whether the Victorian era's continued blandness was due to a cultural preference for plain, wholesome fare over rich, complex flavors, or if the focus on elaborate presentation and strict etiquette simply left little room for true culinary innovation. Was it a conscious choice to avoid foreign or overly spiced flavors, or did the desire for order and control in all things extend even to the palate? You're observing a royal chef, highly skilled in producing perfectly roasted meats and delicate pastries. but perhaps limited by a conservative palate that favored simplicity. The Victorian royal table was a masterclass in social engineering and controlled display, where the actual taste of the food was often, ironically, a secondary consideration. You're now observing the unsung heroes, or perhaps the quietly suffering professionals behind the seemingly endless stream of bland royal meals, the royal chefs. Despite working in the grandest palaces and serving the most powerful figures, their roles were often characterized by immense pressure, limited creative freedom, and a surprisingly thankless task of producing meals that prioritized quantity, tradition, and presentation over innovative flavor. One mainstream historical fact about royal chefs is that their primary role was logistics and consistency, not necessarily culinary artistry. Imagine a chef in charge of feeding hundreds, if not thousands, of people daily, often on the move from one residence to another. Their job was to ensure there was always food, and that it met the monarch's expected standards, which, as we've seen, often meant large quantities of traditional, sometimes unseasoned, dishes. You'd see them overseeing vast teams of cooks, scullions, and pastry chefs, managing massive inventories, and dealing with the constant challenge of sourcing fresh ingredients in an age without modern refrigeration. The skill was in the management and reliability, not in the invention of new recipes. Their daily battle wasn't against a complex sauce, but against spoilage and inefficiency. Now for a quirky tidbit that reveals the hidden pressures. Royal chefs often faced intense scrutiny and even suspicion if the monarch fell ill. Given the limited understanding of hygiene and disease, any royal ailment could be, rightly or wrongly, attributed to the food. Imagine the terrifying prospect of a king developing a stomach ache and the immediate cold dread that would grip the chief cook, knowing his position and even his life could be on the line. You might observe a royal chef meticulously tasting every dish himself before it left the kitchen, a desperate measure to ensure nothing untoward could be blamed on his preparations. This constant fear of poisoning or accidental illness must have severely stifled any desire for culinary experimentation or bold new flavors. Historians still argue whether the lack of significant culinary innovation at royal courts, especially in earlier centuries, was a reflection of the chef's own limitations or simply the conservative demands of their royal patrons. Were they simply uninspired, or were they constrained by a system that valued predictability over creativity? You're watching a chef, perhaps a highly talented individual, receiving strict instructions from a royal steward to prepare a dish exactly as His Majesty prefers it, meaning precisely the same bland, familiar way it's been prepared for generations. The true challenge for a royal chef wasn't to delight the palate with novel flavors, but to consistently deliver the expected, safe, and often unexciting meals that satisfied the royal tradition rather than their taste buds. We've journeyed through centuries of royal dining, observing everything from the rudimentary sustenance of the early medieval period to the theatrical displays of Versailles and the rigid etiquette of the Victorians. And through much of it, a surprising constant has remained, a persistent, almost stubborn culinary blandness. But why did this monotony endure for so long, despite immense wealth and evolving social customs? One mainstream historical fact that explains this enduring blandness is the powerful role of tradition and conservatism within royal courts. Innovation was often viewed with suspicion, especially when it came to something as fundamental as the monarch's food. The familiar was safe, the new was risky. Imagine a royal advisor arguing against a chef's proposal for a new, exotic dish, citing concerns about upsetting the monarch's delicate constitution or simply deeming it unseemly for royal consumption. Changes to the royal menu were rarely driven by culinary desire, but rather by external factors like new trade routes or evolving medical theories. The comfort of the predictable often outweighed the thrill of the novel. Now for a quirky tidbit that highlights this resistance to change, the sheer logistical inertia of royal kitchens. These were massive operations, accustomed to preparing specific dishes in specific ways for centuries. Introducing a new ingredient or a complex cooking technique would involve retraining staff, acquiring new equipment, and potentially disrupting a finely tuned machine. Imagine the groans from the kitchen staff if the queen suddenly decided she wanted an entirely new type of pastry, requiring unfamiliar ingredients and a completely different method of preparation. It was often easier and certainly less problematic to stick to what was known and established, even if it meant a consistent lack of excitement on the plate. Historians still argue whether this enduring blandness was a symptom of a broader lack of culinary imagination in European aristocratic circles for much of history, or if it was simply a logical outcome of the unique pressures and priorities of court life. Was the ultimate goal not to please the palate, but to assert status, maintain health, as understood at the time, and uphold tradition? You're watching a king, surrounded by platters of familiar, unadventurous food, perhaps with a slight sigh of contentment, not because it's delicious, but because it's precisely what he expects, precisely what signifies his power, and precisely what won't upset his digestion. The paradox of the royal diet is that despite all the pomp and circumstance, true culinary joy often took a backseat to the much more serious business of being a monarch. The blandness, in a strange way, became its own kind of comfort, the comfort of the utterly predictable. As our journey through the surprisingly bland diets of European royalty draws to a close, you find yourself reflecting on the curious legacy of these powerful figures and their meals. What began as a necessity, born from limited resources and rudimentary preservation, evolved into a complex interplay of status, health anxieties, tradition, and logistical challenges. The culinary landscape of the royal court, far from being a bastion of gourmet innovation, remained for centuries a surprisingly unadventurous realm. One mainstream historical fact to consider in this fading light is how relatively recently true culinary sophistication, as we understand it today, became commonplace even among the elite. It wasn't until the late 19th and early 20th centuries, with advancements in refrigeration, transportation, and agricultural science, coupled with the rise of professional culinary schools and renowned chefs who were celebrated for their creativity, that royal dining truly began to shed its centuries-old blandness. Imagine the delightful shock for a modern royal, presented with a perfectly cooked, beautifully seasoned dish compared to the unseasoned roasts their ancestors endured. The evolution was not a sudden burst, but a slow, gradual awakening of the palate. Now for a quirky final thought. Consider the sheer mental fortitude it must have taken for generations of royalty to eat essentially the same limited array of unseasoned foods, day in and day out, year after year. While they certainly didn't starve, the concept of dining for pure pleasure, for the sheer joy of flavor, seems to have been largely alien to them. You might even find yourself imagining a bored monarch, quietly adding a secret pinch of salt to their plate, or perhaps dreaming of a genuinely spicy curry, an impossible fantasy in their time. It's a reminder that even immense power couldn't always buy culinary satisfaction. Historians still argue whether this prolonged culinary simplicity among royalty ultimately contributed to a more robust, albeit dull, digestive system, or if it simply meant they missed out on centuries of gastronomic pleasure that their subjects, in time, would eventually embrace. Perhaps it was a necessary sacrifice for the sake of stability and tradition, a quiet testament to the weight of the crown. You're now drifting away from the echoing dining halls, the clatter of forgotten feasts fading into the distance. The long, slow story of their meals, their very human struggle for sustenance and status, becomes a soft hum in the background. The candlelight flickers once more, casting a final, gentle glow over the quiet emptiness of the vast dining halls. The echoes of clattering plates and murmured conversations soften, receding like a distant tide. You feel the cool, reassuring weight of the past settling around you, a comfortable blanket woven from forgotten routines and ancient customs. The grand banquets, the endless, unchanging meals, all blend into a single, soothing rhythm. Allow the soft ambient sounds, perhaps the gentle crackle of a forgotten hearth, to lull you into a state of deep tranquility. There's no need to wonder about tomorrow's menu. No need to worry about peculiar table manners. Just the quiet hum of history, gently unfolding, inviting you to relax. Let your breath deepen, your thoughts drift like the soft smoke from a medieval kitchen. The world of royal dinners, with all its peculiar blandness, now fades into a comforting stillness. Sleep comes easily, a soft, dreamless descent into the quiet of the night.